to these exercises. It's just, everybody kind of remember what they were talking about?
Yeah.
All right. Anybody want to volunteer to go first? Okay, we'll go. Okay, so Jill held up her hand back here. You guys, you had, what are yours two? Yeah, let's just do number 2 first. So this is a farm laborer. Jill, can you read the scenario out for us, please?
Sure. My name is Tony, and I used to live on streets in New Orleans. I was homeless for almost 5 years. One day, a man named Ron Evans came up to me. He told me he was looking for men to work on his potato farm. I told him I was interested in the seasonal work he offered to me. Mr. Evans asked me where the homeless shelter was, so he could ask some of my friends to come as well. So I took him and introduced him to some of the other men in the shelter. We are set to work on the fields by Mr. Evans and his wife, and they told us that we had to pay $50 per week for housing. Each day after a long day on the fields, we could buy beer and cigarettes from Mr. Evans, and sometimes he also had some cocaine. We didn't have to pay in cash, but Mr. Evans and his wife deducted the purchases from our salary. Some workers bought so much that they became indebted. Now, for us, we had a couple questions that weren't answered, such as, were they allowed to leave? What was their weekly pay? So we looked at, the 3 things of the purpose and act and all that, and we saw that they were recruited, that they had to pay for their house $50, and that some people created debt by buying too much beer, cigarettes, and cocaine. So those people, we thought, possibly could be involved in trafficking because there was that created debt. And we also were wondering, did the owner create an environment that they were forced to stay?
Right, so there's basically some more questions you want to ask.
We feel some people could be.
But do you see some red flags? So basically, what's making you uneasy in this scenario?
Like, how old is Tony? We don't know that either.
Okay, we don't know how old he is, but what do we know about him?
He's working, he's getting paid.
What was he doing before he was working? Okay, now, what does that suggest?
He's vulnerable.
Okay. And what did the guy do? He recruited more homeless people, right?
From the shelter.
Yeah, so there should definitely be some red alarms going off in your brain when you hear a scenario like this, because traffickers often do recruit from vulnerable populations. So with sex trafficking, you'll hear about recruitment from juvenile detention facilities, or recruitment sometimes at malls, or there's even operations that have worked in schools. But in this case, the vulnerable people group were these homeless men. What a better group of people to exploit, right? Who's going to be looking for the homeless guys? And if you take them from a city and put them out on a farm, how are they going to get back anywhere, right? So the opportunity to keep them in a bonded, indebted kind of situation is really intense. Then you've got things like this kind of this indebtedness that's building up, at least with some of the men, which is another red flag. And you kind of get this company, the old days with the coal companies where they had the company store. I don't know if people are familiar with that. So that you had everything you bought was from the company. And basically, you ended up spending your whole paycheck on the stuff that was in the company store, and you get in debt to the very people that you're working for. So is that kind of scenario that could possibly be playing out here? But you're right that you should ask more questions. We left this purposely vague. But there was a situation very similar to this that actually did occur, and they were actually recruiting from the Salvation Army. Yeah, at a homeless shelter that we found. I mean, we didn't know that, but that's what was happening. Okay. Yeah. No. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So Jamie is reminding me that for those of you who would like to stay after we finish this review, there's a worship. There's going to be worship for those who want to stay. And who's leading that, Rick?
Some of the students.
Some of the students are leading it. Is it going to be in this room or next room?
It will be, and it'll be 20 minutes or so.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Sorry, I almost messed that up. Okay. So that's number 2. Number 1, let's go back up. So would one of you read this scenario for us? was brought up?
My name is Mati.
Oh, you have two? Yeah, I'm gonna have them do it first. Okay.
Okay, my name is Mati, and I'm a 27-year-old Romanian from the city Cluj. I could not find any work in my city or the surrounding areas, so I signed up at a job agency. A couple of weeks after I signed up, the agency contacted me and asked if I was interested in working abroad. They told me there were positions available in Germany. I agreed, and the agency promised to make the arrangement. They told me that they would contact me as soon as possible. A couple of days later, the agency called me to tell me they found work for me in a slaughterhouse in Germany. I would have to work for a year, and I would be paid 1,200 euros a month. I started working at the slaughterhouse and had shifts of 10 to 14 hours per day without breaks. Also, the promised 1,200 euros were in fact 900. And on top of that, our employer deducted money from our salary for accommodation and the use of tools. Most of my colleagues were Romanian, and one told me he had to give his passport to our employer. We went on strike because all of the conditions were unfair. That made the manager so angry that he assaulted us and broke the leg of one of my colleagues. I contacted a trade union, and they took action. The trade union went to the police to report our situation.
Okay. So when you're thinking about the trafficking definition, are there any elements of the trafficking definition that you think apply to this story?
Yeah, we said recruitment, we said harbor, transportation, and that's kind of where we left it. I had said coercion, but they said no.
Okay, so you think there's some coercion?
Yeah, because he had to give his passport to the employer.
Or at least one of the people did,
Right.
maybe him, maybe someone, okay? Were there any other elements of coercion in the story?
Force in the assault, right?
Okay.
And fraud in the deception about the price of the.
Okay, so we're seeing some fraud, right? Because there was
Yes.
just an original promise that isn't being lived up to.
That's right, 1,200.
Right, and that's
euros
pretty
tonight.
substantial, and the conditions sound pretty abysmal. It was so troubling that some of the men, organized and tried to resist. What happened then?
They were assaulted.
Okay, so are they allowed to strike or allowed to protest their conditions?
No.
Right. So,
Also, local labor laws were not respected.
Right.
uh-huh.
So there's already some criminality in there. You can't make somebody work for 10 or 14 hours with no
Without
breaks,
any
in
breaks.
Germany, especially.
So now what? Not everybody's life is broken.
No, but it doesn't matter. It's
That
one,
was a threat.
and it's threat and any harm, right?
Excellent! Come on! All right, my last prize of the day. You go, lady. Right, so what we have in this scenario is really they're creating a climate of fear. Okay, so you don't have to subject every person in the scenario to the same degree of violence, but if they've seen it occurring to somebody else, that's going to, create a climate of fear where they want to comply and go along because they know something could happen to them. They're afraid of what could happen to them if they don't go along with the coercion that's going on. So we definitely see force. We see elements of fraud. We see now again. I think the confusing part for people is that, will they have to strike? How could they even strike? Because sometimes people initially resist,
Right.
but then they meet with a greater force, which is what's happened here with the physical violence that occurred. All right? Okay. So I'm not saying that this is definitely trafficking, but there are really strong indicators. And if you're interviewing this person, you're gonna, bells should be going off in your mind, and you should be thinking about what other questions could I ask that would really make this clear for me, or make it clear for a prosecutor that this is trafficking.
And the part for me that made it trafficking, but the young lady, she was saying, well, I said they had to work for a year. In all honesty, or at least most jobs, you don't have that kind of commitment. And if so, there may be a a modeling agency, but that's different. You're signing a contract. That's different. You're like a contracted employee. I don't think of someone working in a slaughterhouse as a contracted employee where you must work in the slaughterhouse for a year. So
And
that,
think about this enterprise. I mean, how many people want to work in a
yeah,
slaughterhouse?
that's the other way.
Okay, so again, this is to suggest another working context in which there's a higher likelihood that there could be trafficking victims because not so many people want to work as in butchering.
Exactly.
Right.
And then you're normally trained to be a butcher,
Yeah.
so that's something different.
All right, so definitely a lot of red flags there and some indicators. Now, and we did number 2. Let's see, group. You had number 3, didn't you? Group here in the middle. Okay. So, Sally, will you read that out for us?
Sure.
Okay.
My name is Nelson and I am from South Africa. After years of employment in South Africa, the company I worked for went bankrupt and I became unemployed. In my search for work, I came into contact with a South African company which had close relations to an American company. They told me that they had work in America in the granite and marble business. The company assured me that visas and other work permits were no problem because the two companies were aligned. When I started my work in America, my boss told me I had to pay for my visas, housing, tools, and food. He said that he would reduce those costs from my salary. At first, I refused and told my boss about the arrangements in South Africa. At that point, my boss told me the arrangements in South Africa did not apply here and that I didn't have a valid visa. He threatened me to tell the police that I was illegal and I should do my job and pay for all the expenses.
So trafficking or not trafficking?
Trafficking.
Trafficking, okay, and make your case. So why do you think it's trafficking?
Well, I think there was recruitment, there was obviously transportation going on, there was fraud, there was coercion, and there was debt, bondage, and obviously involuntary servitude. I mean, he objected and, you just better do what you're told or else I'm going to report you your own call.
Very good. All right, great job. You really covered the definition well. Good. So, any questions about that one? Okay. Let's look at number 4. Let's see, did you all have 4? That table? Or did you all have 4?
No, we have 5.
Well, we'll skip 4. Okay, 5.
You had 4 and 5.
All right. All right, let's look at 4 real quick then. Is it Megan? Do you mind reading? Okay.
A couple of years ago, I met a man who promised me work in the United States. He told me that he was the owner of a bar and I could come work for him. I asked him about the permits and visas and he told me that he would take care of it. Later, he contacted me and told me that he found a way for me to come to the U.S. He had a friend who agreed to marry me, and because I would be married to an American citizen, I could work and live in the U.S. I agreed and married the man and went to the U.S. The bar was not really a bar, but a nightclub, and my husband made me do strip dancing there. I was together with 9 other women from Eastern Europe. My husband and boss threatened to beat me or to tell the police about my fake marriage if I did not dance.
Okay, so what do you all think? Was this trafficking or not trafficking? Yeah. Okay, so and why would you argue that it is? What are the indicators that you see based on the definition?
I mean, she was kind of a mail order, right, in a way. But then forced to commit sex acts, stripping. And then also coercion through, we're going to call the cops on you.
So abusing that legal process, right? We talked about abuse of the legal process, so taking a legitimate process but using it to get other people to do something illegal or against their will, yeah. Okay. Yeah, that one was fairly straightforward, so good. And now we've got number 5, which is this interesting scenario. Let's see, I can't remember your name. Would you be willing to read this tomorrow?
Okay. Female wrestler. My name is Lexi. I'm originally from a small town in Georgia, the state. A couple of years ago, I met a man named Norris. I met him at a gas station outside of Atlanta, and he asked me if I was interested in a career in wrestling. He told me that he was a professional wrestler, and now devoted his time to train women like me to become professional wrestlers. This offer appealed to me because a professional would teach me, and I would likely earn a lot of money. I decided to join his team of female wrestlers and get wrestling training. I lived at his house and there were many rules. Norris was very strict, almost military-like. He had to get up early in the morning, say vows, make pledges, and abide to his rules. His house was called the General's Quarters. I got a list of tasks, namely to train myself, take care of my hygiene, and learn social rules, such as talking with my hands and how to make eye contact. The list also included having sex with Norris. After a week, we went to a party where Norris had me have sex with multiple men while he was watching. These parties became more frequent, and we would also go to nightclubs and other places where Norris made me trade sex for money. I needed the money to pay for my debts and fines. If I did not follow Norris's rules, he would fine me, and having sex with men was a way to pay for those fines, my living expenses, the training, and all the other things I needed. The other girls and I would also be taken to trailer parks to sell sex for men there.
All right, so what do you think? Group trafficking or not trafficking?
Definitely.
Trafficking. All right, so how would you make the case?
The key is Norris made me have sex for money. So he sold them, he had profit, he also harbored them and transported them. It's all the classic signs.
And recruited?
And recruited and fraud, it's everything.
But did he beat them?
No, because he used psychological tactics and debt.
Because, she probably could have just left.
But he used the debt against her.
Right, so, I think what some people would argue is that, there's not much of an indication here of physical violence, but we see these indicators of psychological coercion. So I'm just playing devil's advocate. This is definitely a case of trafficking. But these vows, these pledges, abiding by rules, he used the general, creating this very strict regimen and then getting this also these fines, which were basically a means to creating debt and indebtedness to him, and of course also selling them to other men. But I think for some people this case was confusing in the past because they didn't see overt means of force. So this is one we really have to focus on, the psychological elements of coercion. And again, this is based on, it's not the exact story, it's kind of fabricated based on a real scenario where female wrestlers were recruited by a guy named Norris who's currently in prison for doing this.
So he was successfully
Doing this. And
He's
this is
convicted.
female, one of the things to point out here is how bizarre these scenarios can be. Who would have thought of trafficking women into a female creating this female wrestling ring and basically using it as a front for prostitution.
But that's doing any wrestling with that.
They did, wrestling ended up not, except for fighting the men off, I guess.
I would probably also ask her when she says that he made her trade sex for money. Well, what would happen if he didn't? There might have been the threat of physical harm as well.
Or
Good.
also on the psychological level, he's helping her better herself, like helping her speak better. He's giving her training to be, a better person. So she probably has respect for him. He's actually helping me. So okay, sure, I'll do that for you.
Right, and initially she's willing to go along because she doesn't want to give up the opportunity. She's met at a gas station, which is kind of making you think, well, what does she have to go back to? Those are some questions you might want to. So why would she? Probably, again, a prosecutor, or excuse me, a defense attorney for Norris is going to be saying, well, why didn't you leave? Why did you walk away? Why would you stay? So some questions to help, just for, as if I was a prosecuting attorney, to get more answers to, where, did she have any other options? And what kind of things might have happened if she had not gone along? Did she become afraid of him even? Or maybe it's a scenario where she actually did develop an attachment for him too. So anyway, but just, the main reason we do this is just to show you how weird these things can get. Like female wrestlers? Really? That's how bizarre some of these scenarios can be. Okay. Who had 6? Anybody have 6? Okay. Let's see, after getting your, is it Ashley? Okay, Ashley, will you read the first?
My name is Jeanette, and I'm a 16-year-old girl from Haiti. 2 years ago, I was taken. Is that right?
Oh, sorry, I was on 7.
2 years ago, I I was taken by a woman from my village, together with 5 other girls, to a witch doctor. The witch doctor performed different kinds of rituals for us. He told us we should work hard and take care of our families in the villages. He told us that we should follow the rules or else we would go mad or our parents would die. He took some of our hair and some of our clothes and mixed them with chicken blood and cast all kinds of spells over us. After the rituals, the women told us that we were going to America to work because the witch doctor had told her that in America we could make a lot of money for our families. In America we were told to have sex with many men and had to go out on the streets late at night. Me and the other girls did as we were told to, otherwise the witch doctor would make us go mad or we could get a disease.
All right, so trafficking or not trafficking? Really? I don't see any violence in this story.
Well, he took them, there was the act to America, and they were forced. There was the means, and the purpose was to make money.
What's the force?
The witch doctor.
Them going mad or getting a disease.
You don't have
We
to
were
go
told
past
we
the first
have
sentence,
to.
though. Well, right, you didn't have to go past the first sentence because of the age, right? So she's a minor, right? So she can't give meaningful consent to participation in the sex trade. And then also, this idea, the coercion in this is what kind of coercion? Cultural, psychological, based on religious kind of, voodoo witch doctor stuff. You think that's real?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so this is a very real kind of scenario. We've heard about it a lot, particularly with Nigerian women being trafficked into Europe and places like Italy. So many of them go through this voodoo type ritual, and it's incredibly powerful form of coercive control. Pimps don't have to lay a finger on these girls because they're terrified that some sort of, that they're going to die from this hex that they've had placed on them. So that's the reason why we use this scenario, just to show you another form of psychological coercion that can be used on victims. So we'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody. I hope these have been helpful in getting you to think through the trafficking definition and all of the broad kind of scenarios that can fall under the trafficking umbrella. So, all right, it's time to